Hello and welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's tremendous to have all of you with us today. It's been an extraordinary weekend, although our speakers might tell you differently. But it has been an extraordinary several days and frankly, an extraordinary several months. I am delighted to be chairing this webinar, moderating this conversation with two of the world's leading experts on the Middle East, on international relations more generally, and friends of mine who I've known and worked with over many years and have great personal admiration and respect for. Are very well known to anybody reading about the Middle East and terrorism. Both of your writings are well known to all of us. So let me begin very immediately. I'll come to you first, Dan. Dan, if you could give us your sense of, I guess we'll start with the state of play, just to kind of give us an overview of how you understand this current moment, what surprised you, what didn't, and what you are really watching for.
So the United States has been building towards this moment for several months. It slowly assembled an armada in the Middle East, moved air forces to various bases, and the result was the largest deployment of military force in the region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So the possibility, at least, that the United States was going to go to war was quite clear. In the weeks leading up to this, what was not clear was what the Trump administration wanted to accomplish. There was no address from behind the Resolute desk to the American people. Administration officials gave a bunch of justifications for using force, some of which were quickly debunked, frankly, by the media. And there was a real question of what the United States was trying to accomplish. When the United States did strike, we now know it does appear to be driven in part by a tactical question, which was intelligence revealed that Iranian leaders were meeting, and that if the United States and Israel hit at the right moment, that it would decapitate senior Iranian leaders, including the supreme leader. And that opportunity seems to have been deemed too good to pass up. So a lot of this was precipitated by really an intelligence moment. In the next few days, we've seen this war slowly but fairly steadily spread, where Iran has responded by striking at the bases, but also the cities of a number of countries in the Gulf states, as well as Israel. There have been attempted attacks on Cyprus. The United States and Israel have hit really all around Iran, striking at missile and military sites, but also Israel has been striking at numerous leadership sites. So all this is quite extensive. What is still a bit unclear is what the United States is trying to accomplish. In public statements, at least, President Trump has laid out a wide range of objectives, including the nuclear and missile programs, but also regime change. But the way military force is being employed, it's a little unclear how some of these objectives are going to occur, at least in the short term. So I would say we're seeing quite extensive military operations, but still some confusion at the strategic level in the United States.
Thank you, Dan. Lisa, let me come to you to get, again, maybe building on that, but giving your own estimation of how you saw the lead up, how you would analyze the current moment.
Well, I agree with Dan. I think this didn't come as a surprise in the sense that the United States had signaled in its troop deployments and so forth that it was likely to do some kind of military move. I think I'm still not completely persuaded that the precipitant that all of the Iranian leaders were together was quite as much of an intelligence coup as it seemed to have been, because it was the equivalent of Monday morning and everybody was going to their office. I'm not sure. But, that will come out in the wash ultimately, I suppose. I think the interesting thing is that we, for obvious reasons in the United States, are very focused on the American part of this, but it's clearly being driven at least as much by the Israelis. And I think the Israeli sense of what they hope to accomplish is somewhat clearer. They would really like to see this regime entirely dismantled. Whether that's something that the Trump administration is really in for, if that takes a very long time and turns out to be very difficult, is less clear. So what the Trump administration has done is leave itself a little bit of ambiguity about how long it's going to be doing this and sort of see how well it goes, and then decide at some point, presumably, that it's succeeded and will, end the conflict. Whether the Israelis are comfortable with that or not remains to be seen, of course. And I also think from the Iranian side, this is an existential battle. They're doing exactly what you would expect an ideologically driven regime in an existential battle would do. And so from that point of view, I think, in a way, the most predictable of all of the players right now are the Iranians.
Dan, let me bring you into this conversation, I guess, about whether you estimate Israel and the U.S. to have a common objective. I know that's a very difficult question to answer, but still. And whether you anticipate that they will remain aligned in the days and weeks ahead.
So I think the U.S. objectives are not fixed, which makes this more difficult than it normally might be for other operations with U.S. allies. I think Israel wants to weaken Iran. Ideally, of course, they would see Iran abandon its nuclear program completely and have regime change. But the Israelis tend to be very cynical about that sort of thing. And in my view, are more likely to believe that this is a chance to hit Iran further, to cripple its missile program and set it back several years. And perhaps in the future, operations might be necessary again from an Israeli point of view. But for now, setting it back is really an accomplishment and something that should be done. It's unclear to me how much President Trump is on board with a narrower interpretation, or whether he really believes the more maximal sort of objectives that he has laid out. And my guess, and this is a very difficult leader to anticipate, is that he's perfectly fine with changing his mind. And at some point, he'll decide the operations have run their course, that the cost, whether it's higher gas prices or additional U.S. casualties or concerns of allies, that these are too high, and he'll declare victory at some point. And he'll be willing to say about regime change that we gave the Iranian people a chance. We removed the supreme leader and others, and they had their moment. They didn't seize it. That's their fault, not America's fault. So I think that the alignment is likely to continue, at least enough to continue operations. Politically, it's very hard for Israel to be openly in a different position from the United States. It's, of course, the weaker partner of the two. And Netanyahu recognizes that Trump's attention could easily shift, and also that Trump has tremendous political capital at home that he could use against Israel. So I think Israel will try to keep the United States happy while achieving what it believes it can on the ground.
Lisa, you've spent years obviously studying the Middle East, but you've spent years living in the region. You've traveled since you've moved back to the U.S. several years ago. You've traveled back and forth to the Gulf extensively. You understand the conversation. How would you analyze, looking at it from the perspective, and I know it's not a region, and there are different interests, very complex ones, but if you were going to begin to give us a sense of how informed were U.S. Gulf partners in the Gulf likely? What will their positioning be now? What is at stake? If you can give us just, or whatever direction you'd like to go from the perspective of the region.
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the interesting sort of, there's so many wild cards in this that to add another one, it doesn't seem to change things very much. But I do think it's interesting that I don't think that most of the Gulf governments anticipated being drawn in to the extent that they have been. So this was going to be a battle between the United States and Israel and Iran. And I think the Iranians, in not only attacking some of the military bases, but also what they construe as, hotels where Israelis live and operate and so forth and so on, in Dubai, for example. I'm not sure everybody anticipated that. So as we think about the sort of day after, and whether President Trump is happy, whether the Israelis are happy, I also think there's going to be whether the GCC countries, which, as you point out, are actually somewhat at odds about some of this. They don't all agree on what ought to have been done or what should be the outcome here. But that's also going to be something that's a little bit hard to anticipate. Again, I think we could parse the differences among the GCC countries and so forth. And part of the differences is going to depend on how dependent they are on the Straits of Hormuz, how worried they are about their own income, the state of the oil markets and so forth. But I think they also have somewhat different views of the dangers posed by the Iranian regime. So being drawn in as much as they are, I think, wasn't quite their calculus. And so they're going to have to figure out at what point do they want to say, all right, that's enough.
I mean, not only not part of their calculus, but, is it the case that the Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi wanted to, were sort of willing to we're willing to give priority to stability over this kind of sort of shock and non-potential change, which brings with it heightened instability. I mean, attacks on the airports, right? In countries that, people from across Europe, across the world like to work in, make money in, go on holiday in.
Right.
I've forgotten which European leader, a Secretary of Defense, a photo of him on a personal holiday, sitting in the airport, like stuck. I mean, I think over here, certainly in Chicago, it's not necessarily the number one holiday spot. For a lot of people, it is. And so is it fair to say that the trade-off was one that the Gulf states were willing to make, which was deterrence, stability, kind of dial down the tensions in order to be prosperous and rich?
Well, I mean, look, their calculus is, they're in a complicated part of the world. If they were to say, okay, we really don't want an attack on Iran because it would interrupt our, airlines and so forth and so on, at a time when the United States and Israel had decided they were going to do it, that wasn't going to happen. So they're trying to figure out how they manage maintaining a sort of public relations position as this, these islands of stability in a turbulent world, when in fact, this turbulence has now begun to wash up on their shores. So I do think it's a complicated moment for them. I don't think that they had looked forward to that. On the other hand, I think the sense that Iran continued to be mischievous and difficult as a neighbor, if that could be resolved relatively easily and relatively quickly, and by someone else, that is to say the United States and Israel, maybe that's a cost worth bearing.
Dan, what is your estimation of this, the regional perspective? I know it's not one perspective.
So I defer fairly strongly to Lisa on this, but I would say sometimes the regional states don't really get a vote. Right, that these things are going to happen, and as small states in a difficult region, they're actually quite skilled at reacting and being opportunistic. And a number of states, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, do, however, have direct lines to the Trump administration, as does Qatar, and can reach the very highest levels and have numerous personal connections as well. And as Lisa mentioned, there are differences of opinion in how hard to go after Iran among these states. But I will say, as the conflict has spread, they are going to be looking to the United States for protection and for air defense in particular. And I don't want to drag the people watching this through some of the more technical details, but the United States has very limited reserves of a lot of air defense munitions. And there are a lot of things that need to be defended. And that's going to be a vulnerability. Now, one of the big questions to me is some of these states that didn't want to be involved or had only limited interest in this war, as their civilians start to be hit, does that actually push them in a more warlike direction? Right? I think Iran's calculus is that by punishing them, it can increase the pain on the United States, and also it's a way of showing the Iranian people that the regime is striking back. But in the past, when Iran has tried to widen wars, it's often backfired. And I think that might be the case here. But that said, I think this is difficult to anticipate.
Dan, maybe you could say just a word, about two things. One is, could you just give us a rundown in your mind? What are the things that need to be defended that the U.S. is now going to be, it might not follow through, but that is going to be called on to defend? And also related, we're watching these suicide drones, right? We're watching this rapidly evolving technology that seems to be cheap and capable of inflicting pain. Is this, in your mind, a game changer in the region, or is this just? This is, we've watched this in Ukraine. We're watching this now play out in the Gulf, in the region. What are your thoughts on this? And again, I think it is worth hearing a little bit about what it is that the U.S. is going to be expected to defend now.
So, at a minimum, the United States would be defending its own forces, and that's its own naval forces and military bases and so on, which Iran has struck through rocket and missile attacks, through drone attacks. And there's, of course, depending on where they are, the danger that Iranian proxies will also do attacks. And so that's a concern. But then the circle starts to get bigger and bigger. Do we talk about civilian facilities? Do we talk about allied government facilities? Hotels in allied and partner countries. The Iranians are casting a very wide net in terms of blame on this. And so a lot of this is going to be a political demand, even though in some cases the United States might not see defending any of these as necessary to the military effort. But there will be an expectation of the people in the region that their governments will protect them, and the governments will in turn go to the United States. And again, some of these things can be defended on the cheap, but a lot of them cannot. A lot of them require sophisticated defenses in order to do so. And the United States didn't have many of these munitions to start. It used a lot in fighting the Houthis in Yemen, which was not something that captured a lot of headlines in the United States, but used a lot of these munitions. And as you said, about what we learned in Ukraine, a lot of what Iran is sending at the United States and its allies are very cheap compared with the defenses being used against it. When you get to military systems, things get really, really expensive very, very quickly. But we're talking systems where the munitions cost in the thousands of dollars for Iran to attack, and the response is in the millions of dollars sometimes to shoot them down. To be clear, there's a lot of variation on that. I wouldn't quite say that the Iranian drone program is a game changer in an absolute sense, but it makes things much harder. Iran is able to strike more targets more frequently at less cost to Iran. And this increases the pain it's able to inflict. But again, I do want to stress there is a broader question, which is whether Iran is actually hurting its long-term interests by creating a coalition against it that didn't exist before this war began. And that could happen as a result of these Iranian attacks.
There is a portrayal in the media, Lisa, of Iran as not necessarily being a rational actor in this moment, just sort of trying to inflict as much pain as possible. I think the narrative that's coming out of part of the media is that Iran wants to inflict as much pain as possible in order to get the U.S. to back down, which I guess raises this question, building on what Dan said. Where does the U.S. go from here? Does the U.S. back down because the next stages are too difficult? Does Congress push back in any effective and meaningful way? Does the U.S. have a responsibility to do more? It's, it used to be we had the Pottery Barn rule. I think we're sort of done with that now. You break it, you fix it. That was the story of the post-Iraq invasion. How do you think both the U.S. next steps can and will develop? And I mean that not only with respect to, what the U.S. is going to be asked to do by the region, but whether you see, you're sitting there in New York, you're surrounded by students and very serious scholars and a policy community. Is this just another, this is the new way that the U.S. does things, decapitation or removing a leader and sending him to a court in Brooklyn and a bit of disruption, and then we move on?
That's a lot of good questions. So I'm not sure.
Choose your question. Choose your question.
I don't think, just to start where you started, I don't think that the Iranian regime is acting irrationally, given its circumstances, trying to widen this, trying to get a lot of other people implicated one way or another to make the whole region unstable and so forth and so on, is probably a pretty good strategy, because they're not going to win in Iran itself, but they may make everything so difficult over the course of, the president says 4 weeks, that it becomes very difficult for anybody to stop. And I think that's a sort of clever, rational actor kind of approach, given their circumstances. It's hard to imagine the United States, this administration, acknowledging that it's backing down. So it will be described as something else. It will be some other rationale. I think what's really interesting to me here is that, in a way, the Trump administration, as people have said ever since his first term, very transactional, very about the sort of, we're going to cut a deal. I need somebody I can talk to that I can cut a deal. The Iranians, by contrast, are very ideological. This isn't about cutting deals. This is about, the survival of the revolution. And so we're just, it's the blind talking to the deaf in some ways. It's just very, very different, sort of conceptions of how human behavior works, and therefore what is a strategic position. But I do think the Iranians, given where they're starting, trying to they're going to try and draw in the Gulf countries one way or another. I think they would prefer if those governments decided that having hosted American facilities was a mistake. They're probably not going to do that, but they're drawn in anyway, one way or another. I think, there are reports now that the Israelis are considering going into Lebanon. Perfect from the Iranian point of view. Just evidence of instability, evidence of uncertainty, evidence of, that the Israelis, from the Iranian point of view, have always wanted to do this, and this is who they really are, and all that kind of stuff. So I think just trying to make this bigger and more complicated, more expensive for the United States in whatever calculus, whether they have appropriate materiel, whether this is going to be expensive at home. So your last part of your question is it going to be expensive at home in terms of the Trump administration? I have to say, I don't think Congress has demonstrated a capacity to act on pretty much anything this president has wanted to do. So I think it's unlikely they'll be able to do anything of any significance. If it lasts more than 4 weeks, which is what President Trump has said, I think you could begin to see some unhappiness, including among the president's supporters. But 4 weeks is an awfully long time. I don't think anybody, not the Iranians, not the Americans, not the Israelis, are really thinking, where are we going to be in 4 weeks?
Lisa, let me come back to you really quickly, though, on Iran, and then I'll come to you, Dan. Can you say a little bit about what you expect? And they have to find a leader. they've lost their supreme, Ayatollah. What is it? Is this just, they've been planning for succession for a long time. They've got their next Ayatollah lined up and it just carries on. Nothing really changes.
Well, one of the things that's interesting, if you look at the history of sort of nationalist movements and other kind of ideological revolutionary groups and so forth and so on, they typically can bring up generation after generation of leadership. The French regularly exiled leaders of nationalist movements in North Africa, and within weeks, the next generation had appeared. I think the Iranians knew perfectly well that this was in the cards, that this was possible. They have both a constitutional system and I think a de facto system for bringing up people who can manage the country in this state of emergency, which obviously it is. Now, again, what happens in 4 weeks or however long the horizon is, who ends up having been the most powerful, most useful of the various government administrations within Iran is going to matter in terms of what the regime looks like afterwards. But they were ready for this, both because they expected to have another go around with Israel and the United States on the one hand, and because as a revolutionary movement, they're just, they've got a lot of depth. And so I think that, and a lot of capacity to spread across a very large bureaucracy, the kind of responsibilities that you need to be able to take in a state of emergency.
Dan, if you want to come in here. So the people, the Iranians that we see across America, across the world, across Iran, cheering the death of Khamenei, hope soon to be dashed. And maybe you want to say something about that or the U.S. side of this question.
Sure. So I want to add one point on to build on something Lisa said before I go to this, if you don't mind. We are 3 professors here as well. And one thing that academics talk a lot about is perception, misperception. And I do believe Iran is acting in a rational way according to what it believes it can achieve. But there are real questions to me about whether it is getting good information about what's going on, what its models are of the United States and how it sees the Trump administration responding to additional Iranian uses of force. Because of the constant risk of assassination, the ability of Iranian leaders to communicate with one another is also a question, and whether that affects command and control. So I worry that there'll be decisions on the Iranian side that they think are de-escalatory that actually lead to escalation. And this sort of thing, has happened on a regular basis throughout history. But I think it's especially risky in these circumstances. To shift over to your, I think, very important question, Leslie, about the Iranian people and regime change. There are different estimates as to how popular this regime is. But one thing I've heard from a number of experts who I trust is, perhaps around 20% of the population is embedded with this regime. Although that means most Iranians are not, 20% is actually quite a large number. And especially when that 20% are the ones that have financial control and especially control the guns. And to me, the risk is that a lot of Iranians heed President Trump's call that we're going to be with you and they should rise up. And they do, and they are simply shot by the local police or the local besieged militias or other regime protection forces. And the United States is not positioned or even intending to help them in a serious way. We know from repeated rounds of demonstrations, but especially the ones that ended in January, that this regime will kill thousands of its own people to stay in power. And the stakes were high in January. I think they're even higher now. So this could be a bloodbath that the United States is perhaps inadvertently, perhaps deliberately encouraging. And war is uncertain. There's chaos going on. So it's quite possible some good outcomes could happen from all this. But I really worry that there are going to be a lot of innocent people killed with no positive political change as the result.
Okay, that's certainly sobering. There are a number of questions in, so I'm going to start with one, and then I'll come to the next one, Lisa. I'm going to start with the Strait of Hormuz. There's a lot of conversation, obviously, about the economic consequences of the current strikes and crisis. But somebody's asked, would you foresee the need to establish an international force to protect the Strait of Hormuz after the conflict is resolved? And, if you want to start with that, Lisa, maybe kind of widen out like what you think that international engagement once there is a calm might be in the
Well,
region.
I'd actually defer to Dan on how you would do that, in the water, if you will. But I do think, one of the interesting things about this moment is that's something the Board of Peace could take up if they wanted to. We've got already a mechanism by which the Americans have already announced they're going to be resolving all sorts of, these kinds of conflicts. So were the Iranians actually unable to prevent this from happening, one could imagine a international body such as the Board of Peace saying they were going to take this up and they were going to pay for reconstruction and they were going to pay for ensuring the free passage of commerce and so forth and so on. So, it's not inconceivable. I just think it's a little bit far for us to get from here to there.
Dan?
So the U.S. Navy has been preparing for an Iranian decision to block the Straits of Hormuz for decades now. And for some people may remember that in the 1980s, the United States was reflagging tankers as part of an effort to protect the Straits. And Iran suffered tremendous losses in that very brief, limited conflict. Really, half of its navy ended up at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. So this is a very high-risk operation for Iran. Its navy hasn't gotten significantly better in recent years. Well, of course, the United States has the best navy in the world. So I don't think it's likely that Iran is going to want to do this immediately. But that said, this is perhaps existential for the regime, and they may decide that, okay, this is not their first choice or even fifth choice, but now they have no choice, and they may put mines in the Gulf or do small boat attacks. There doesn't need to be an international force in military terms. The U.S. Navy could easily handle this, but there's a political logic to this. The oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz goes directly to every major importer in the world. And it is vital to the broader energy supply. And showing that this is not an American concern or an Israeli concern, but really a global concern, would have benefits. That said, this administration seems to be very hostile to multilateralism. So I would be very surprised if that was something they wanted to even consider. So I think this is something that the Navy is preparing for. The one thing I should have added, and should have really begun with this, is even though right now there's not any one declaring that the strait is closed, various oil tankers and others who, in gas and so on, is actually not transiting the straits. That the risk is deemed too high, insurance rates would be too high. So even though there isn't a formal threat to close it, it is having that impact. And in the short term, Lisa knows better than I believe the oil markets and the gas markets can weather this, but there's a longer term question if this disruption continues.
Actually, Lisa, can you weigh in on that, on the oil and gas markets in the short and medium term before we?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's plenty of supply. There's not that, there'll be a little bit of volatility in prices and so forth just because markets like a little bit of volatility, but I don't think that there's a great deal of concern in the sort of short to medium term. Obviously, the longer this lasts, the more uncertain it is, the more there is a de facto, if not de jure closure. It is interesting that the insurance industry, swooped in over the weekend and said everything is going to be much more expensive now and so forth. So, again, right now, there's ample supply. Nobody's particularly worried, but that only lasts so long.
So in our last, you have a lot of questions about Europe, about U.S. partners and allies, well, partners in the Gulf, non-treaty allies, one of them, and about the U.S. democracy. So let's kind of turn the lens back on what this means. We've been watching the Trump administration. Dan, you said, very understated that Trump doesn't seem to care about multilateralism. I think that's probably right. I think there's probably a consensus on that. But it is a big deal not to consult domestically, and it's a significant puts our European allies in a very difficult position, not only in strategic and tactical terms, beyond their borders, but with their people. And some of these leaders are not, in a good place at home. I'm thinking of the British Prime Minister, obviously. And we're seeing a divergent set of responses. The Spanish Prime Minister really pushed back. The Brits sort of saying we'll allow the U.S. to use our bases for defensive purposes. How do you? Does it matter? If this carries on for a period of time, does it matter whether Europe gets on board or not? Let's start with Europe, and then in the next and maybe probably final round, we'll come back to the US. But for Europe, does it matter whether they get on board? Do you think European leaders are going to take a big hit domestically? We can think back to the Iraq War, not the same thing because of, the boots on the ground element, which I think none of us anticipate right now. But how would you, I guess, estimate and capture the implications that this has for America's European allies? Who wants to go first?
Dan, go ahead.
Dan.
Sure, but I want to cheat here. And Leslie, could you chime in as well? I actually think you have certainly more expertise on European allies than I do. So I'd really value your thoughts, not as a moderator, but as an expert. I would say that from a narrow military point of view, the Europeans do not matter much. There's not much they can bring to the table. They don't have the basic access in the region. Their resources are fairly tied up in European contingencies, especially with regard to Ukraine. But this is, to me, just another sign of Trump's contempt for the transatlantic alliance. And this is something that was the foundation of U.S. security for decades, and his administration seems to be dismissing it, really without much thought or considered plan. So I'm troubled by it, but I don't think for this particular operation, losing the support of the Europeans is going to be significant one way or another.
I will add a comment and come to Lisa. I think it could have very significant domestic consequences for many of Europe's leaders, because there is so much anti-Americanism and deep frustration amongst the publics about the way that the U.S. is treating them. It certainly will increase the momentum towards building up their own defense capabilities, which is a long-term play, but there is more movement on that front. It's showing that Europe has very little, certainly the UK, but also elsewhere, has very little ability to stand strong and independent and hold the US feet to the fire. But I think that domestically, what the leader of Spain is doing is a good play for his domestic constituents. And I think Starmer is going to be hammered at home, but time will tell. But he's already in a very weak position, having to explain why he's allowing UK bases to be used for something where the UK was clearly not consulted puts him in a very precarious position, I think. Lisa, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with both of you. I think this is consistent with the Trump administration's policies. It's not different. He behaves as if he sort of forgot to tell people, which is, under these circumstances, very, very contemptuous of a long-standing relationship that the United States built and sustained for decades. I don't know. It exacerbates a problem I think most European leaders already had. I think trying to figure out how to navigate a relationship with this administration, with this United States, was pretty much a no-win proposition before. This just illustrates it quite starkly.
Quite starkly, and again, in a part of the world that, as we all know, Europeans spend a whole lot more time in for pleasure and for work than we might be, than a broader audience might be aware of, and that Americans are aware of. Right? For Europe, the Gulf is just like it's a quick flight to a respite from the god awful long gray winter that sort of plagues most of Europe. As we close, final question. I would really like to get your thoughts, and I'll come Dan and then Lisa, on what this means. Lisa, you already made a comment. Congress hasn't really done much. Does this just wash over? Are American students going to be protesting? Under what conditions does this become a major political problem for this administration? Or is it all contingent on whether, it's short and sweet and relatively, it looks messy right now, but maybe it sort of dies down. Is there any constraint or ability or even desire for the U.S. and its constituent parts to really push back and demand a voice in how the U.S. uses its military power overseas to, remove leaders and get quite engaged in this way? Dan?
So I don't think there's much interest in kind of having this fight from a congressional point of view, as Lisa pointed out. And I think the American people are supportive as long as this goes well and the cost is low, and then won't be if it doesn't go well or the cost gets high. And there has been no effort of this administration to prepare the people to try to build support. So I don't think support for the operation runs very deep. But there's a tremendous military asymmetry here. So in this conflict, it is likely that Iran is going to continue to be hit very hard, and the cost to the United States will be relatively limited. That can change if Iran happens to launch a few strikes that get through air defenses and inflict significant casualties. If the price of energy, gets higher and higher at a sensitive time, there are things that can certainly change that. But I think that this is not something that people are likely to engage on in the sense of putting pressure on the administration. But having said that, this is a president who I don't think is particularly dedicated to this war either. So I think if things start to look bad, he's not the sort of person who is going to say, my reputation is at stake, I must be consistent. I think he'll say, we won, and then try to move on, and actually, for better or worse, probably succeed with that. He has a remarkable track record of being able to change his mind and not have this be a political problem for him.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think the people who don't like this administration will be furious, and the people who do like this administration will be happy. And it's not actually going to change the calculus in domestic politics in the United States that much. Obviously, I agree with Dan. Lots of things, if it drags on for a long time, if there are lots of casualties and so forth, some of his supporters may decide to melt away. And there's a little bit of that, I think, over the course of some of this, even the saber rattling. But I think most people think it's consistent with what they expect of this administration. So, to students and people who are not Trump enthusiasts, I think you'll see some demonstrations and that kind of thing. But you'll also see some rally around the administration, counter demonstrations and so forth as the weather gets nicer.
Interesting. As the weather matters everywhere. We will have the Chicago Council will be releasing some polling in the next few hours on this. I won't preempt it because I might get it wrong. But our team here has been running the numbers, and I think that will show some interesting results. It's been a terrific conversation. It's kind of extraordinary to it feels quite high stakes, very deep consequences for a number of people. And yet everything that you've said, I think, aligns. It clearly comes from a deep base of expertise, and it sort of puts it in perspective. I'm sure we'll return to the conversation, but for now, Dan Byman and Lisa Anderson, thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of you who have joined us. And we will return. I think we have Ambassador Shapiro joining the conversation in a few days and more to come. So hopefully we'll also get you to Chicago before long. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.